Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Um, Happy to be here to talk to people about bumblebees. So that was a great presentation beforehand to get you excited about all the cool biology happening with a lot of different bees. And I'm going to be focusing in on bumblebees, and I'll explain why. My name is Elaine Evans. I'm an extension educator and researcher at the University of Minnesota. And I've been doing bumblebee surveys here in Minnesota for a good long time. The last 2 years, I've been doing those in partnership with the Xerces Society, who have been organizing Bumble Bee Atlases kind of all over the US. Leif Richardson, who was just presenting, has been working on this out in California. So I'm doing a presentation that I've been collaborating with Katie Lampe and Rich Hadfield, who I've been partnering with the Bumblebee Atlas work that we've been doing here in Minnesota. So see if this will forward for me. There we go. So I mentioned these Xerces run Bumblebee Atlas projects have been happening in a wide range of places across the US. And doing that, there's a lot of different partners that have been involved. So the University of Minnesota is just one of them, but lots of different state and academic organizations, as well as support from funding from places like the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service to be able to get these projects running and off the ground, collecting information about bumblebees. So one question that you might have is why focus on bumblebees? So for all of these different kind of bees that are out there, 20,000 different kinds of bees. We just saw a glimpse of some of the diversity of them in the last presentation. There's a lot of them to track down, a lot of them that we need information about. But bumblebees are a bit easier to focus on as a first step for getting more information about all these different kinds of bees. Number one, they are easier to find. So this picture here is showing the largest and smallest bees that we have in Minnesota here. So this is a queen black and gold bumblebee, along with and next to it, that tiny little thing there is a male sweat bee. Lasioglossum purecki is the species. So you can imagine it's a lot easier to find these big bumblebees than it is the teeny tiny sweat bees when you're out there looking for them on flowers. It's also easier to get good photos, to be able to, for volunteers to be able to document them. They're generally easier to ID. Of course, there are some tricky bumblebees out there, but overall, there are good resources for being able to identify them to species. In addition, because of these other things where they're easier to find, easier to ID, we do have more historic records. And some of that is thanks to previous presenter Leif Richardson, who's compiled an amazing database, the Bumblebees of North America, with a lot of these historic records. So we can see where we know bees, at least these bumblebee species, to have been. And in addition to that, bumblebees are very charismatic. They're these large fuzzy bees. They're a generalist forager, so they're not specializing on a narrow range of flowers. They're within different species of bumblebees, they'll have preferences, but in general, there's a lot of different flowers that you can find them on out there. They're also active for a long time through the season. A lot of other bees will only see them out as adults for a couple of weeks of the year. Bumblebees we'll see out there from April through September here in Minnesota. They're also an imperiled group. So part of that reason why we know that bumblebees, there are a good number of bumblebees that are in trouble in terms of their conservation, is because we know more about them. As we know more about other bees, we'll learn more about their conservation status. But for bumblebees, We know about their conservation status, and it's not looking great, where about 1 out of every 4 species of bumblebees is in a threatened or endangered conservation status. When we're looking at getting information about bees to try to answer these conservation questions, we one of the things that is talked about in the bee scientific community is this idea of tiered monitoring. So there's some monitoring we can do where it's casual, where we can just have people taking photos and submitting them, and then we can get information about where different species of bees are located. Super easy for everyone to participate. And then we have these more structured observations that we can have people participating in, where we have photos, but we also have other data. So people who are doing this kind of monitoring, they need some training, but with this, we're able to actually track populations. So instead of just where these bees are, we're able to get information about what those populations are like. And we're also able to get better associations with habitats, which can help us come up with conservation actions to help these bees. There has been an explosion of observations in bumblebees across North America, but here I'm showing some data just for Minnesota, where I've been doing a lot of this work. And so with the help of public participation in data collection, we're able to rapidly learn more about bees. And I'm highlighting 2 different programs here that have been collecting records. So Bumble Bee Watch is one of them, which I'll be talking more about, as well as iNaturalist. iNaturalist is you can have it as an app on your phone, or you can join on their website. With both of these, you're taking photos and submitting them as the kind of the minimum step. iNaturalist collects information about any kind of living thing. So they tend to have a lot more participants, a lot of people who are out there just documenting everything, whereas Bumblebee Watch is focused just on bumblebees. So Bumblebee Watch is kind of like an eBird, if you're a birder at all and familiar with eBird. We're focused just on one group, on the bumblebees. And we assume that most of these observations are these casual observations, but some of these are also those structured observations. Looking at where these observations are in Minnesota and what we've been seeing. So these observations through Bumblebee Watch and iNaturalist have documented 21 out of 24 of Minnesota's bumblebee species. And those other 3 that haven't been documented are ones that are of conservation concern. They haven't been documented anywhere. We're not surprised that we haven't seen them yet. But over 27,000 records in total since 2009. So great data. You can see these observations do tend to be clustered where there are more people. So especially around the Twin Cities area is where we have the most observations, but we do have them spread out throughout the state. And so Bumblebee Watch is this across all of North America. There have been over 100,000 observations, over 30,000 different participants. One thing that happens with the Bumblebee Watch observations is that they're verified by experts. So there are bumblebee scientists that go in and verify all the records. And we also are starting to collect survey data in a lot of these regions, which helps us to answer more questions. So this is where we get into participatory science. There are a limited number of bumblebee scientists in the world, and we can't cover the same territory that we can with the help of the public. So by engaging the public, we're able to really cover a broader area, get these baseline data sets and monitor population changes, distributions of species, and also fill knowledge gaps about habitat associations. I'll show how we've been doing this in Minnesota. So the basic project design is that the states that we're working in are divided up into grid cells, and then volunteers adopt a grid cell. They complete training, which we do some virtual and some in person, and then you survey your grid cell and you submit your data. Those grid cells, there are different priorities that are set for the different grid cells based on information that we have previously. In Minnesota, we have, besides just these priority areas for surveying, we also have another limitation with the grids that have a lot of coverage for potential areas where we expect to find the rusty patch bumblebee. Since as these surveys, volunteers are handling bumblebees, we recommend that if it's an area where this endangered species, the rusty patch bumblebee, is found, that you do have a Fish and Wildlife Service recovery permit. So we do have a handful of grid cells, which we're very fortunate to have strong populations of the rusty patch bumblebee, but that means that, that we need to organize with different state and federal agencies, different groups that are already permit holders, and get them to cooperate and help us to cover these areas to get those surveys done. For Minnesota, looking at what we have for our areas, the gray ones that are grayed out here are ones where we have over the last few years, we've gotten enough surveys there, are kind of our bare minimum. We are happy to have more surveys done in any of those areas, but these purple grid cells are the ones where we really want to encourage people to adopt those areas if they can, so that we can get more information, get more coverage across the state. And when I was designing this and picking purple as a color, maybe some people might think, oh, the Minnesota Vikings. No, I picked purple because of our blessing of having Prince as our as a Minnesota treasure. And so so we picked purple to represent Minnesota grid cells as a dedication to our dearly beloved Prince. I mentioned we do have online training, so we have a whole series of videos. We coordinate with this national effort with other states, so we have trainings that we're able to have that that work kind of across all the area, as well as Minnesota specific trainings. So we do have a volunteer handbook. We have a guide to Minnesota bumblebees. I mentioned the ID resources. So this is one of the resources that we have highlighted on the Pollinators Summit website as a PDF that you can access. And since we do have 24 species of bumblebees in Minnesota, depending on where you are, most places, at least if you go east and south from Minnesota, all you need to do is subtract some bees off of there, and this guide works perfectly for you. If you go further west, you're gonna run into some different species, but this guide should work pretty well for a lot of the eastern US. We do also offer field training where we have people come out with us to practice capturing bumblebees. So the main way that we have volunteers submitting data is from taking photos. So there's a lot of training in learning how to take photos properly. We do have volunteers catch bees. You can use nets, or if you have larger jars, you can just catch bees right into the jars. You place them, the bees, on ice for a few minutes so they slow down enough that you can take a few good photos. And this taking good photos is really key. It is important to get a few different angles on the bees to get ID correct. So a lot of ID can be done for color patterns with a lot of bees, but some of them we really need to see what's happening on the face. So getting a straight shot on right of the face as close as you can is great, as well as a photo from the top and a photo from the side. Then we can usually see all the features that we need to see to distinguish the different species of bumblebees. So here's some examples of photos, and you can see a lot of people have, kind of fancy cameras. These can be also taken with phone cameras if you're careful, and just make sure that you're getting up close using kind of macro functions, getting these bees in focus to be able to see those features that we need to see. It also helps if you can get them to go like this and leave their wings out to the side so that you can actually see the color patterns on their abdomen. A key thing that's different than just having photos that are submitted, counts of bees, is that we also have our volunteers, our participants out there doing habitat assessments. So these habitat assessments help us to key in on what's happening in the landscape. They also document what's going on with the flowers. So this level of detailed information that our participants are collecting really helps us to get into those details to know what is happening with the bumblebees. I'm highlighting some of our results over the last few years with some of the surveys that have been happening in the Midwest. So Minnesota, we have a couple years of data here in the Atlas. Nebraska has been going since 2019, Missouri since 2020, and North and South Dakota and Kansas just started this last year in 2022. But we have over 1,600 surveys that have been done by nearly 350 participants. So, and you can see they're spread out throughout the states. A lot of them are still concentrated in these higher population areas, but we are getting spread out to get those data. One of the exciting things is that we are documenting these bumblebee species that are of conservation need. So a number of species of conservation need have been documented throughout all of these states. I wanted to highlight a few of the kind of results that we can get from doing these kinds of surveys. And this is actually from surveys that were done previous to this effort. So previous to partnering with the Xerces Society on these multi-state atlas programs, we were doing some just in Minnesota here. They were funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, and it was part of the Minnesota Bee Atlas, where we were actually looking at not just bumblebees, but also looking at tunnel nesting bees. And that was a project where we were out there from working with volunteers, with public participation from 2015 to 2020. So talking about that kind of extra level of information that we can get, here are some information that we got about community structure of the bumblebees. These maps here, they have most of these little black dots are iNaturalist observations, but we do have some of the open circles are showing some of the historic observations. The different colors on Minnesota are our different ecological provinces that we have in the state. So we have a few major ecological provinces with the prairies in the west, the northern forests in the up north in the northeast, and then kind of in between we have the eastern broadleaf forests with more deciduous and mixed grasslands. And the thing that's different that we can do with the information that we have from the Minnesota Bee Atlas is that we're able to change the size of these dots based on the average number of bees of these species that we saw that were on routes that volunteers covered each year. And I have two of our more common species highlighted here. So Bombus impatiens is the common eastern bumblebee. And we can see that even though they do occur up in the northern part of the state, that they are more abundant down in the southern part of the state. And kind of opposite pattern happening here with Turnarius, the tricolored bumblebee. And this one is, it does occur down in the southern part, but far more abundant up in the northern part of Minnesota. And we can also use this to look at some of our less common bees. So Aphanus is the rusty-patched bumblebee. And here we're able to see that, that we did see more rusty patch bumblebees in these sites that were actually nearer to the Twin Cities than sites that were farther out. And this is with part of the reason why we're able to say that is we have the same survey effort happening at all these surveys. So volunteers are going out, they're spending the same amount of time looking at the same amount of area. So we can say that these are differences that we're seeing in abundances of these bees. Here are a couple more detailed results, so a couple statistical things here to talk about. So again, looking at those different ecological provinces in Minnesota. So up north, that's the Laurentian province. Then we have the prairie parklands and the eastern broadleaf forest. And what we're looking at here is just bumblebee abundance overall. So we grouped all the different bumblebee species together. What did we see on average on these survey routes that people were running? And comparing that across these ecological provinces. And what we saw was a significant decrease in the number of bumblebees that we were seeing in the prairie parkland province. And one important thing to note here is that for these surveys, these were done in roadside habitats. And so it's not so much saying that prairies aren't good for bumblebees. We have lots of other research from the Bee Lab where we find lots of bumblebees out there in restored prairies and remnant prairies out there. But in roadside habitats, we weren't seeing as many bumblebees out there. There weren't as many flowers. So this is showing more that we have an opportunity to increase the quality of roadside habitats, particularly in this prairie parkland area of Minnesota, to make things better for the bumblebees that are out there. This other graph that I have here is a multivariate analysis. We're looking at land cover and the abundances of these different species of bumblebees. And what this multivariate analysis means is that we put all of these different data together. They have all these different dimensions to them with all the different land covers and all the different species. And we squish it down to look at it in these two dimensions. And the different axes here, these different quadrants of this graph are showing different land covers. These arrows show the length of the arrow shows kind of the strength of this relation. And then where the bumblebee species are placed there shows if they're related to that land use. So up in this upper right corner, that was mostly representing forest. And we see two species here, Bombus vagans and Bombus terricola, that were both associated with forests. A bunch of species that were associated more with grasslands and crops. Interestingly, here in developed, you'll notice the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, which we noticed more of them in the Twin Cities on that last slide. We do see this possible correlation with developed areas, and so this has is more than just, that's where we're looking more. We were looking in other places. We were seeing them more in developed areas, possibly. So these are all relationships that need to be explored more, but helping us to figure out where these endangered species are so we can know how best to help them. Also, the data from these atlases that have been done in Nebraska, Pacific Northwest, have resulted in these habitat management recommendations that are more specific for these different areas to really hone in on how to help bees, how to help land managers help bees. So I have also one of these Xerces slides with showing all these different supporters. I want to highlight a few. For this project, we've been cooperating with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, as well as getting funding with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we're really wanted to highlight them, but lots of other support from the Xerces. So thank you. We have, I'm hoping that you'll get excited and find one of these Atlas programs in your area. I'm happy to answer questions if anyone wants to email me.